Hi, everyone. It's about 2 minutes until the start time. So the start time is 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will most likely start 2 minutes after, as again, we're expecting a large number of people to join. So just as a reminder to folks that there is a questions box that is available to you. Please post any questions that you may have in that area, and we'll do our best to answer the questions as we go along or try to answer them towards the end as time allows. But again, we'll start about 1:02 p.m. Eastern, so 2 minutes after the actual start time. Thanks, Ryan. Everyone, it is 1 p.m. Eastern time. We are going to start in about 2 minutes just to give people time to get in so that way they don't miss too much of the session. Just as a reminder, again, there is a questions box that is available to you in the GoToWebinar control panel. Please feel free to post any questions that you may have during the session. We'll do our best to answer those questions during the sessions, or we'll, if time allows, we'll answer them towards the end of the sessions. But again, we'll start in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the DMARC Bootcamp. We're in, obviously, week 3. This is the second session of week 3. In this session, we're going to, again, go over DMARC, and we're going to talk about DMARC similar to what we did last week with SPF and DKIM, where we broke it down to the different components and different parts and the tags that are associated with it. So we're going to do the same thing with DMARC here, is we're going to break apart the policy and focus on what are the different parts and the tags to it. And then the last half of this session is going to be giving you a demo of how to create SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records on a bind system. So bind being your Linux DNS. So for those, if you attended yesterday, the first half will be the same. There won't be much of a difference, but it's the last half that's going to be different. So again, just as a reminder in terms of how we're doing this. So right, in terms of DMARC, remember there's 2 parts to DMARC, right? There's the DMARC policy, is what the sending organization is going to put into place, and there's the DMARC verification side, which is the recipient organization is going to implement and put into place. Our focus, again, in this session is going to be the DMARC policy, right? Because the DMARC policy is something you actually have to go into DNS to create. You have to actually put it together, and we want to talk about the different parts of the DMARC policy when you're creating it. DMARC verification is not what we're going to get into because that varies based on the type of security gateway or email systems that you have. right? And there's so many different flavors out there. Each one is going to be different on how they implement it. So really what you just need to do is go to your email security gateway and check to see if it has DMARC verification capabilities. If it does, turn it on, right? Typically it's either an on or off, or it's a checkbox that you put the check mark in to turn it on. There may be some other features that are involved with the verification aspect of it, like in terms of, do you want to override policies, things like that. It depends on the system again, and it varies. But our focus is going to be on the policy side and how to create the policy. So things you need to have, or at least consider to have at your fingertips if you can, for implementing things like DMARC, SPF, and DKIM. Know what your mail systems are and mail servers, right? Because those are primarily you're going to need to set up for SPF and DKIM. But there's different parts of DMARC in terms of things such as reporting, which you need to know and make sure you have that information available to you. You need to have some level of access of DNS, whether you're the admin or not, right? You need to know, and that's what we're going to create. We're going to show you the types of records you're going to create in DNS, but either you yourself are going to put them in if you have access and you're the admin on DNS, or you may have to supply this information to your DNS admin or the person or your IT staff who is responsible for the DNS environment, right? And so make sure you know what your change control requirements are, how long it takes to do go through the change control process and so on. Have a list of public domains, right? Because what you're going to do is when you're implementing DMARC or even SPF and DKIM, you're going to put this on each and every single public domain you have, right? We talked about this in week 1. Where does DMARC apply to? It applies to any public facing domain, whether you use it for email or not. So if you have that list, it just helps you go through the process, and you can eliminate some right off the bat, especially the ones that you don't use for email. You can eliminate those and create the DMARC policies, and I'll show you how to do that later on in the demonstration side. Now the other thing is that with SPF and DKIM, if those aren't in place, that's great. That saves you a step. If they're not in place, it's not a big deal. You can technically get started with DMARC and implement DMARC at the lowest level and not have SPF and DKIM in place. And it's a matter of opinion, and people's opinion vary on that. Should we implement DMARC now and then worry about SPF DKIM later? Yes, you could do that, but that's as long as you stay at the lowest level for the DMARC policy. Once you get to the higher levels, then yeah, things will start breaking, and you need to have SPF and DKIM before you go to those highest levels. So those are things to take into account when you're doing implementation. Now, when you're creating the DMARC record inside of DNS, what you're creating is specifically a TXT record or a text record, right? So when you have DNS, right, in DNS there's various types of records that you have, right? Most common people are aware of like an A record or maybe an MX record, those type, or a CNAME type record. But there's also TXT, and that's specifically the type of record that you will create when you're creating a DMARC policy. Now, when it comes to creating the DMARC or these text records, there's 2 parts. There's a host name, and then there's a value, or in some cases they may call it a text instead of value. The host is going to be the actual name of the record, right? Because in some cases you do have to name the record. So for DMARC, the name is always going to be _DMARC in lowercase. So _DMARC. That is required. There's no exception. There's no array around it. If you do not put the underscore, it won't work, right? It has to be _DMARC. And then depending on the type of system that you're using, you may have to append the domain name. So you may have to put in _DMARC.companyname.com, but that depends on the type of system you're using, and we'll go into that more when we actually do the demonstration. Then you have your value or your text, right? The value is going to be defining what is your policy. What are the different components? How is your policy functioning? So this way the receiving side knows what to do based on your policy, right? And these are the components that we're going to go into. We're going to talk about what V equals and P equals and so on. What do these all mean, right? This is what we're going to do in this first half of this session. So what we did was just provide you a slide, so that way people, if you go back to when you download the slide deck and to look at, you have one slide that you can just refer to for everything that's in there. But I have a separate slide for pretty much every single one of these. So We have ones that we listed as required. We have some that are recommended, considered using, and some that are optional. And I'll explain what each one of those mean as we go along. The one that I want to focus on first here is that one under required, which is V equals DMARC 1. That is absolutely required. That is the very first tag you're going to create or you're going to implement on your policy. So the V equals does not come at the end. It's not put in the middle. It's at the start. Always start with V equals DMARC 1. Is it case sensitive? Yeah, so the V is going to be lowercase and DMARC 1 is going to be capitalized. All right, so the tags stay lowercase, but everything else, so aside for, what can be, is not case sensitive, but the V equals DMARC 1. DMARC must be capitalized. All right, you may have heard of things like version DMARC 2.0. What really people, when they talk about DMARC 2.0, is that they're actually saying or incorporating other mechanisms alongside with DMARC. So you may have heard of something like BIMI, right? Or, so people are calling that DMARC 2.0. It doesn't mean that you're going to put in V equals DMARC 2. No, what that BIMI is just another mechanism, which we'll talk about in the wrap-up session in week 5. So in 2 weeks, we'll talk about what BIMI is and how to actually implement BIMI and how to utilize BIMI. But that doesn't mean you put in V equals DMARC 2. You always stick with V equals DMARC 1. And then just, so the next one that we're going to talk about is the P tag. Now the P tag has to be second, right? So you always start with V, you always start with the P, and then second is the P tag. After this tag, you can put any of the other tags in any order that you want. But it always has to start with V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals the policy level, semicolon. So that's the other key part. Each tag is separated by a semicolon, right? So the semicolon is required. If you leave out the semicolon, the policy is not going to work. So V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals none, P equals quarantine, or P equals reject, semicolon, right? So only one policy per domain. So remember that. So you can't have two policies. You can't have a policy of none and a policy of quarantine for the same domain. That's going to cause issues. It's going to cause problems, right? So only one DMARC policy per domain. And as it is, in most cases, when you're creating records, they won't let you typically use the same name. You do have to use unique names and for the most part. Now, what are these policy levels? Again, just as a reminder, so you have those 3. So none is what you should always start with, right? Because that's the lowest level. That's the one that there is no DMARC enforcement occurring at all. So no messages are being blocked due to DMARC. So all you're doing by putting in the P equals none is that you're going to add additional tags to enable things like reporting, right? Because if you just do V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals none, semicolon, you're not benefiting anyone. You're not doing anything. Yes, you have a DMARC policy, but that policy is not doing anything. It's not effective in any way, right? Because you're not blocking any fraudulent messages by having P equals none. But then at the same time, you don't have the other mechanisms enabled. So how do you know whether you should be going to quarantine or reject? You don't until you enable the reporting mechanism. And that's why the none is important, because you'll implement that, enable the reporting features of DMARC, and then collect those reports, review the reports, and make the adjustments that you need to make, and then move to quarantine or reject. So someone asked, no double quotes. Yeah, it's not double quotes. It's not double quotes. If it requires quotes, it'd only be a single quote, not double quotes. Thanks for that catch. So once you review the reports, then you move your way to quarantine and reject, right? Because if SPF, DCAM, and alignment, if those were to fail, quarantine messages go to spam junk folder. If it's a reject, the messages aren't delivered at all, right? So you need to make sure that you are set before you move to quarantine and reject, and that's why don't just put in P equals none, semicolon, right? V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals none, semicolon, and then put in the reporting mechanisms, because now you're using DMARC the way it's supposed to be used and utilized. So V equals, P equals, those two are required. The next 2 tags I'm going to talk about are RUA and RUF. These are your reporting tags. So this is how you turn on reporting and enable the reporting capability by adding these tags. Now, in the previous slide, I said that RUA, the aggregate report, is required, right? The RUA tag is not required, okay? It is optional, but from our standpoint, from GCA's stance on this, is that the RUA tag, you need to have that. At minimum, for reporting capabilities, you need to have the RUA tag, right? Because that's the one that's going to give you all the information about what's going on with SPF, what's going on with DKIM, what's passing, what's failing, and who you're sending, who the sending IP addresses are that are using your domain name, right? So that's something to take into account when you're doing. So RUA, we're saying is required. I mean, especially if you're using the none, put in the RUA tag, because otherwise the P equals none and you stop there, your policy is not doing anything for you. Now, so RUA is for aggregate reports and RUF is for your forensic reports, and they are different. I'm not going to go deep dive into it because that's what next week is for. But so the aggregate reports are the ones I just mentioned initially. So that's the one that collects that gives you that aggregate view of over a certain time frame of what's going on with the messages. The forensic and failure reports, really quickly, those are the actual message itself that's bouncing because of some sort of failure. So whether DKIM failure, SPF failure, or something like that's going on. So you get the actual full-blown message. But again, I'll go into details with those in next week's session and talk about some of the issues and concerns with some of the forensic reports. And I'll actually show you one as well. So when you're putting this in, V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals none, semicolon, then RUA equals, then you have to have mail to colon and then the email address. Then semicolon, RUF equals, mail to colon, and then the email address. You can send to multiple email addresses if you choose to, right? So the way you do that is if sort of RUA, if you're sending multiple to multiple email addresses, you don't use the RUA tag twice. What you do is if you look at the last example, RUA equals mail to colon, the email address, comma, mail to colon, the second email address, comma, mail to colon, the third email address, then semicolon. Right, so people are asking about, someone's asking about the quotes. You don't have to have the quotes. It really, again, depends on the type of system you're using. You're gonna need to have single quotes at minimum. No double quotes. So the double quotes, yeah, you're not using double quotes. So how many email addresses can you put in? I mean, technically you can put in as many as you want. The recommendation is don't go more than 3 or 4. There have been reports of people saying that when you go past 3 or 4, that those other ones don't necessarily get all the reports. They may only get part of the reports or may get some of the reports. So the recommendation is typically use 3 or 4, don't go any more than that. Also, who should you send it to? When you're creating these reports and you're sending up the reports, you can only by default send the reports to someone internal to your organization. You can't send it to someone outside. You can send it to somebody outside, but there's certain actions at the receiving side of the reports. If you want to send them the reports, they have to take additional actions in order to be able to receive those reports. All right, so that's something you have to take into account. So you can't just send them out to anyone, right? Because technically, if you did that, people can start spamming other people. But so there's some control mechanisms in place too. So they have to actually create an entry on their end in order to be able to receive reports. So those are 2 things to take into account when you're doing this. The other thing is that remember that the DMARC record, you're creating the DMARC policy record is public. It's public facing, right? So because you're creating this on your public DNS, so anyone can look up your DMARC record. So the email address you should use on there, use a generic one. So like the examples here are showing DMARC-RUA and DMARC-RUF. Consider using those instead of using your own personal work email address, right? That way, because now your work email address is now out in the public, so you don't get you potentially get spam from those. But if you have a generic email in there, you can just have that. You let it get the spam all at once. It doesn't matter because it's a generic email account at this point. So strongly recommend use a generic email account as opposed to something like admin@company.com or like smears@company.com or something like that. So again, so the multiple addresses, yes, those are comma delimiters. So you're separating with a comma, right? So if you look at on the slide, the very last example there. So V equals DMARC 1 semicolon P equals none semicolon RUA equals mail2 colon DMARC dash RUA at companyname.com comma mail2 colon admin at company.com semicolon, right? So this is what you're going to use when you're doing it. So yes, you are using this. Sorry, you are using the comma to do the separation. So don't add another RUA tag. Use the comma, and make sure every email address starts with a mail2 colon. That's critical in this case. So there's also another question about lowercase, uppercase. So the V equals DMARC 1, that has to be uppercase. The other ones there, it can be lowercase, uppercase, doesn't matter. It's depending, so this DMARC dash RUA is just something that we made, an email address I just made up. But this one doesn't matter. The V equals DMARC 1 must stay capitalized. Everything else afterwards, so after the P tag, the tag has to be lowercase, but the values can be uppercase or lowercase. Now, the remaining tags that I'm going to talk about are optional. So meaning that they're not required. If you do not use these tags, what will happen is that the DMARC policy will use the default setting for that tag. Okay, and on each of these slides, I define which ones are the defaults so that we are aware of it. So if you do not explicitly define the tag, then it will revert to the default of that tag, right? So the first tag is the FO tag, right? This is only to be used if you actually have the RUF tag, otherwise it doesn't apply. So, so if you don't put in RUF, that means you're not getting forensic failure reports. So therefore the FO tag is not really going to apply at that point, even though technically the default setting would be in place. So what you have is various options. So the default value is 0. And what the default value of 0 means that if if all authentication mechanisms, so DKIM and SPF, fail to produce an aligned pass result, then trigger a forensic report. One is that if any one of them, so if it's SPF or DKIM, then trigger it. And then the last two are DNS. So D is strictly for DKIM. So if DKIM has a failure, regardless of alignment, it's going to send a report, or S is going to be for SPF, and that one's going to be triggered if depending on that situation. The default is 0. Most people tend to stay with that. I would recommend actually doing 1, because if you want it for any underlying authentication mechanisms. So either, it doesn't matter if it's both, it should be either or. So just go with 1. So FO equals 1 if you decide to use that tag. The next two are ADKIM and ASPF. Again, these are optional. And what this is going to define is the alignment mode for DKIM and SPF. So if you remember last week, we talked about SPF and DKIM alignment, right? Right, for DKIM, you're making sure that the DKIM signature domain matches the from domain. Right, for SPF, you're making sure that the recipient from or the envelope from domain matches the from domain. Right, that's the alignment, where you're making sure that alignment occurs. So what you can do in DMARC is you can define strict or relaxed alignment, and the default is relaxed. All right, so when that is the relaxed mode, that is the default, and that is the one that majority of people use, especially when they're using third-party vendors, right? Because what you're doing here is that because if you have third-party vendors, you're relying on them to make sure that their DKIM domain and the SPF domain actually matches yours. And in some cases, some mail service providers just don't do that, so especially with SPF. Their SPF domain may not match your actual from domain. So that's why you end up staying in relaxed, and you need to stay in relaxed for both ADKIM and or especially ASPF. I mean, in some cases you can get away with ADKIM and put that into strict alignment if you choose to. But the thing is, and so why relaxed alignment is okay is because what you're basically looking to do is that you're making sure that, again, you're saying that as long as if the subdomain matches the domain, so if the from is a subdomain and the domain in DKIM or SPF is the top level domain, you're saying that's fine. It's okay, because I mean, it's at least the domains match. It's not a big deal. For strict, it has to match exactly. If it does not match whatsoever, it's going to be considered a fail, right? How would you ever know if your alignment is actually matching or not? Again, is from those reports, right? The reports will tell you, this is your DKIM domain, this is the DKIM domain that's being seen, this is the SPF domain that's being seen, and if you're continuously seeing them as constant and the same at all times, then you can make them strict. You can go in there and put in a DKIM equals S and a SPF equals S. Otherwise, you can just stay with relaxed alignment. Now, do you have to use them both at the same time? No, you don't. So you can just put in ASPF, or you can put in just a DKIM. You don't have to have them both in together. All right, so it's not required to put them both in if you'd use just one, or you can use one or the other. The next two tags, again, also optional, are RF and RI. What the RF tag is defining the format of the reports that are being generated. So AFRF is the default, and IODF is another option that you can choose. And how do you know which one to go with? I mean, honestly, I just recommend the default. The only time you may want to consider which one to use is if you're using something like a SIM device or Splunk, and they have certain requirements in terms of what type of format the information needs to be ingested into those types of tools. Then you may have to use IODF, but again, that depends on the vendor at that point. But otherwise, just stick with the default, or you don't even need to include the tag, right? Because by default, if you don't have the RF tag defined, it'll automatically be the AFRF format. The second one is RI. That defines how often the reports are being delivered or sent. So reporting interval in seconds, and the default is 24 hours. But again, remember, this is in seconds, so 84,600 seconds. So be careful when you do this, when you implement this and put this in place, because if you put in RI equals 24, you're basically saying that the reporting interval should be 24 seconds. And that's going to be a lot of reports you're going to get. So you don't want to, you want to stay with a high number, or if you don't feel it's necessary, don't use it. The only time that I ever see people actually using the RI tag is when they're at level none, and they're also seeing a large spam campaign occurring with their domain name. So they need to get to reject right away. So they lower the reporting interval, so that way they can report a little bit sooner, and they can start making adjustments as they need to, right? So it's not exactly 24 hours that you're going to get it. It's going to be within a 24-hour time frame, and then the report that you receive will give you an aggregate of the information within that 24-hour period, or whatever period that you define. So be careful with that RI tag. Just remember that it is in seconds if you choose to use it. PCT, so percentage tag, is also optional. So the value for this is anywhere between 0 and 100. The default is 100. And what this is basically defining is what percentage of messages should be impacted by the DMARC policy, right? So if you put 10%, so it means 10% of the messages that are being sent out or the receiving end should be impacted by the DMARC policy. Which 10% or 50%, that's not something that's defined in the policy. That's something that the receiving side could determine to which one they should and which ones they shouldn't use. So, I mean, personally, I don't really recommend using the PCT tag because honestly, if you're going up to quarantine or reject, there's a reason why you're doing it. You might as well just stick to 100%. So, but some things to take into account and a caveat. So if you put in the policy level of quarantine and your percentage value is 0, that's P equals none. That's the same as P is equals none. There's not any different, right? And if same thing, so for reject and your percentage level is 0, that's quarantine. So you might as well just state that P equals quarantine at 100%. So, I mean, I've seen some people use it. I haven't personally seen any benefit for it or any real major benefits in terms of people reporting back to me the benefits of it. But I mean, it is an option that you have if you choose to use it. And then the last tag is the SP tag. So the P tag, when you implement the P tag on its own, by default, it actually applies to not only your top level domain, but actually applies to your subdomains as well. Okay, so you can just create a top level domain and automatically applies to it. So if your policy P equals reject, that applies at your top level and your sub level domains. So this is up, they create the SP tag because there's certain situations where you may have subdomains that are actually being used by email, but they're not ready to be at a DMARC policy of reject. So when you move your policy to P equals reject at the top level, now all of a sudden your subdomains are being impacted by it, and those messages are potentially getting rejected because their SPF and DKIM are not set up correctly. So they created the SP tag so that way you can put this in and say, okay, you know what, I want to get to reject, but my subdomains aren't ready yet, so let's put in SP equals. And you can put in SP equals none, right? So the SP tag, the values are the same as the policy tags, the P tags. So you still type out none, quarantine, or reject when you do this. Right, but the other option is that if you know for a fact that you do not have any subdomains, well, if you're at P equals none, what's to prevent attackers or spammers or phishers from using your subdomain? This tag, the SP tag. So what you can do is you can leave P equals none, but then add in P equals reject. So now your subdomains are protected while you're still reviewing your reports and doing analysis of your reports and fixing your SPF and DKIM configurations and moving your way up from P equals none to P equals reject. Okay, but you need, that's why that before I talked about like know what your public domains are, right? Because if you only have one public domain that's being used for email and there are other public domains are technically subdomains like www. Or that you're using for web purposes, then you can actually just put in SP equals reject and you're protecting those. Or you can define a policy for each one as well. So that's when you should use the SP tag and when you consider using the SP tag, right? But all you really need to do to get started is just what you see in the basic option, right? Just create that host name with _ DMARC, put in your V equals DMARC1, semicolon, P equals none, semicolon, and then your RUA and RUF tags, right? And then the other ones you can adjust as needed while you're going through and reviewing your reports. But the SP tag is one that you should kind of consider while you're doing this initially as well. Because if you don't have subdomains, you can put in that SP equals reject, right? But then if you do have subdomains used for email, you should maybe consider putting in SP equals none just for your own sake. So that way you know that if you go to P equals reject, you're still safe with that SP equals none tag in there. All right, so let's move on to the demonstration. So there we go. So what I'm going to show you now is how to create records in Bind. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change screens. So what we're going to be using is a terminal window. So in most cases, depending on your systems, you might be using you might be actually on the Linux system itself. So you may not be using a terminal window. You may end up using, there may be a graphical interface that you can actually use. But I've SSH into our Bind server and our Linux server. So that way, in this case, I'm going to be using a terminal window to show you how to do everything, which will be somewhat similar. And then what I'm going to also be using is I'm going to be using Office 365 to get the records. That way I'm not generating records or necessarily creating records. I'm actually showing you a full process in a sense. So we're just going to be setting up, in essence, Office 365, but using a public-facing Bind server. Now, the other thing to take into account that this Bind server that I'm using is actually not public-facing. So it's actually it's restricted. It's just a test machine that doesn't have really a proper internet connectivity. So it's not actually a live DNS server that I'm using here. All right, so when you're using bind and you're going in and setting up a bind system, what you're going to do is, and again, depends on the system, in most cases, you're going to be in something called etc bind zones. It's the zones folder that you're going to go in and create and adjust your zones, right? So the one we're focusing on is going to be DMARC.org. That is going to be our system. That's going to be our domain that we're working with. So this is the database or the system or the file that we have to make changes to. So I'm going to go in and do sudo nano db.dmarc.org. And this is my bind file. So this is where I'm going to define all my records and create all of my records when I'm seeing this. So as you can see, there's already some in here. So there's one defining your name, the name servers. There's one defining our MX record for the mail server. Here's some other ones that are pointing to what, DNS or www or mail servers or public facing IP addresses are. So again, these might be IP addresses out in the public, but this isn't ours. These are just ones I just kind of popped in there as examples. So if you try to go to www.dmarc.org, it's not going to work. And so, it may go to our DMARC site, but it's not actually 150.11 and so on. So in here is where I'm going to make my entries, and I'm going to create all my SPF, my DKIM, and DMARC records, okay? So this is where everything is actually going to go in and be inputted in here. So there's a couple of things you have to take into account when you're working on a bind system, okay? You have to know where you're actually placing stuff, because there's going to be a line in there, which is this, $origin.dmarc.org. Okay, what this line is basically saying is that anything after this is going to be considered part of .dmarc.org. Whereas anything above it, you actually have to define the domain it's associated with. So that's why in here above, you see the full names. You see mail.dmarc.org. You see DNS2.dmarc.org, right? You see the full names in here. Whereas below, you just see www, you just see DNS1. You don't see DNS1.dmarc.org, right? So those are things that, so take that into account. So make sure, because sometimes this is not in the middle of the file. Sometimes this is a little bit higher in the file. So see if this exists. If you see if this $origin exists, because if it exists, it actually can help you and save you some time in terms of creating your records. All right. So those are a caveat and something to take into consideration when you're working with your bind files. So now let's create an SPF record. So we're going to create an SPF record. I'm going to create it above the origin.dmarc.org. Because this is where, technically you can actually create the blank files and you can define all the information that you need to define. Now, when you're creating the SPF record here, there's a couple things you can do, right? So remember, when you're creating SPF, it has to have a blank name, because what the blank name basically means is that it should actually take on the actual domain name, so the actual host domain, okay? So in this case, I'm going to create the SPF record above here because I can actually use the @ symbol, and then this by default actually uses the actual domain name. The other option is that I can actually create it underneath here, but I'm going to do it up here in this case. So it's you define in, so in is required because you're saying that in, and remember, it's a text record that I'm creating. Okay, so it's a TXT record that I'm creating when I'm doing this for SPF. So now I'm going to use Office 365 to create this text record. So what I can do in here, so I'm in the admin center for Microsoft 365. What I do is I go to settings. Under settings, I go to domains. And under domains, I go to my domain to see what kind of records are required in order for this to work correctly. So it tells me these are the type of records I need to create in order to be allowed to be able to send and receive mail using Office 365. So I do need to create an MX record, which is not there, but that's something I do need to create. But I also need to create this text record, and it gives me the value, right? It tells me what the name of the record should be and what the value of the record should be. So I just need to take this and put it in here. Now this is where I'm going to be using single quotes. You could say in is for inside, yeah. I mean, and it's like a kind of in a sense, kind of defining the record type. So yeah, it's in the text record in a sense. Now I'm using single quotes here. Typically, when you're using a Linux system, I mean, you don't really have to use it for SPF. but it's just a habit of mine just to use the single quotes, because when I create the DMARC record and I'm going to create the DKIM record, you have to use the single quotes. And I'll tell you why when we actually create those. So this is my SPF record. So now at this point, all I have to do is save it, and now I have my SPF record, right? And then if I need to make modifications or changes to it, I can just go in here and make the change. Again, just go in here and modify my records, right? Because I have an MX record for mail.got.dmarc.org. Well, okay, then so that means that I need to actually go in here. Since I'm not defining mail.got.dmarc.org, I can just put in MX. So that way, because technically what I would also need to do is I need to create an MX record, right, for the other Outlook protection file. So I need to actually create this one, put this one in as well. Oops. Right, I need to put this in as well. So, you know, if I put the MX tag in here, I now capture both of these. Now, one thing to take into consideration, right, we talked about those SPF lookup type situations. So what you can technically do is you can actually remove, whoops, keep forgetting when you're using this, you actually have to use the arrows to scroll everywhere. But what you can actually do is I can actually put in IP4 : and then put in the IP address of the mail server, right? .11.21.101, right? Because what this will do is it reduces the lookup. So I don't have to look up mail. So because this is considered a domain, in essence, technically it's considered a domain, so it has to look this up to get the IP address, right? So that's something that I can do so that I don't have to look up the IP for this. So that can help reduce that domain lookup, the 10 domain lookup issue that we had talked about last week. But that's just an example. So this is where you would put in here. So any third parties that you may have, this is where you're going to put that in, right? So if you have another third party, so you put in include : and then the information. So like spf.google.com, for example. But make sure you find out from that third party vendor what it is that you should actually be inputting in here, right? Don't just look up what their mail record or SPF record looks like, right? Because you don't copy their SPF record. You actually have to go in and look at, you have to actually go in and into the system and say, this is what is being used, right? Because that way you get the right SPF information instead of just putting in everything that they put in. So that's an SPF record. Seems easy because inputting it is easy. It's getting all the information and collecting all the information. That's going to take some time, and it's going to be a little bit more difficult to do. Okay, so that's SPF. So now the next thing I'm going to show you is how to do DKIM. Right, so now when it comes to DKIM, there's various ways you can do it, but again, it depends on who you're utilizing, right? So if you're using a third-party vendor, in most cases, they're going to give you a CNAME record that you're creating and that you're defining when you're doing this. So that's something that you have to take into account. That's something you have to take into account when you're creating this and when you're defining something like this. All right, so make sure that you know what the requirement is. So don't just go in and just use some like an online DKIM creation tool. What you need to do is go to that third-party vendor, find out from their resource guides in terms of how to create a DKIM record and how to do it, because you have to go through some validation processes as well when you're doing this. Okay. So, and that's one thing, like for Office 365, for example, you have to actually go through a validation process, because what you actually have to do is you have to create the records first and then go in and define what you're doing and what needs to be done, and going backing in and validating and enabling it. So what you can do is to find out what are the records that you need to create is what you do is under the admin center. So the lower half of it, you go to Exchange. When this pops up, you go to the Protection tab. And under Protection tab, you're going to go to the DKIM tab. So there's a specific tab for DKIM. So here's Protection, and then there's DKIM. Now by default, what Microsoft does for you is it actually has DKIM enabled, and it's actually doing DKIM signing for you. But what it's doing is it's using got.dmarc.onmicrosoft.com as the domain to sign your messages, right? So DKIM can pass, And the reason it's passing is because the DKIM domain is got.dmarc.onmicrosoft.com, and it's checking with got.dmarc.onmicrosoft.com, and it's valid and says, okay, it's all there, it's all good. But DKIM alignment is going to be thrown off because the domain in the DKIM signature is got.dmarc.onmicrosoft.com, which does not match the from domain, which is got.dmarc.org. So therefore, DMARC is going to say that's a fail, right? Because DMARC alignment is now, or sorry, DKIM alignment is now off. So what you actually have to go is you actually have to go in here, click on your actual domain that you're using to send, and that's actually in the from address, and you have to click on enable. Now it's not going to work because the records aren't created. It's going to actually tell us to create the records first. What tells you what type of record to create. So CNAME record is what you're going to create, and that's what you have to publish. So you have to publish these CNAME records first, and then come back, enable, and then try enabling it again. So then this is the case with most third-party vendors that you have to do. Is I know MailChimp does that. I believe SendGrid does that. I believe some other ones as well. They actually do that. They tell you create the record, come back, click on enable, click on validate to confirm the record is there, and now you can actually have domain alignment in place. All right, so you actually have to go in here and create the record. So in this case, I'm going to create the DKIM records down here. Okay, so now one thing that you can do is down here is you can actually section things off. So I can actually go in here, put a semicolon, say DKIM records. So that way, this way I know where all my DKIM records are. Okay, so now I'm going to create a DKIM record. So in this case here, now they're not telling you what the record name is. They're just telling that these are the values of the record. So selector1-got-dmarc-org and so on, that's the value that you're going to put in. That's not the actual record itself. When it comes to Microsoft, the records are always going to be selector, the names. So the record names are always going to be selector1 and selector2. So you put in selector1._domain key, then tab, in, tab, CNAME, tab, and then the value that you're actually putting in. So selector1 dash DMARC, oops, sorry, got DMARC dot, oops, dash org dot underscore domain key dot got DMARC dot on Microsoft.com, right? So that's the record. So, and you can always go back here and check selector1-got-dmarc-org._domain key and so on and so forth. But Microsoft uses two, doesn't just use one. So basically the same thing over again. I can just copy this. But just make sure that you change the second one to 2, so that way it's inputted, so it's inputted correctly. So those are the two selectors. So this, if I'm using these third-party tools, this is how you create a CNAME record in Bind. Now we might say, okay, well, why didn't I add the .got-dmarc.org after the selector1 domain key? The reason why is because where I placed it, right? $origin.dmarc.org is here. So that because this is here, it automatically appends so this automatically becomes selector1._domain key .got-dmarc.org. If I actually put got-dmarc.org after this, it would actually append, it'll become got-dmarc.org .got-dmarc.org. So that's something that you actually have to watch out for, and you have to be careful with. Yeah, you can put in the the period at the end. It's not, you don't have to do it, but it's something you can put in if you needed to. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, it is, thank you for pointing that out. I mean, that is technically, it's good practice to have that in there. And technically that should also be up here as well. All right, so that's how we create a selector, or sorry, a record or DKIM record if this is what we were using. So I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly save this, but I also want to show you is that say you're using your own mail server. right? So say you're using your own mail server. So say you say like SendMail or Postfix or whatever mail server you're using on Linux, or even if you're, that you're using. So those tools, those mail servers actually have an actual built-in capability of doing DKIM creation and DKIM signing. And that they actually use a tool called OpenDKIM. It's an open source tool that's actually built into that. So I'm going to show you how to create these keys using OpenDKIM. So that's if you're using SendMail and or those other, most of the Postfix or other Linux types systems. So just check to make sure it's built in, because that's very important, right? Because if there's no DKIM signing built in, then that's going to be an issue, right? Because you need something to actually do the signing, not just the key generation, right? OpenDKIM is a separate tool you can actually use just to generate keys. But if your mail system does not do signing, that's a problem. All right, so make sure that that tool is capable of signing. But if you have an email gateway, so if your messages are going through that gateway, check to see if that email gateway does DKIM signing and DKIM key generation. Because if it does, do it on that system, right? So Mimecast, Ironport, those types of tools actually do that. So it's best to do it there. Now, this type of key, when you generate this, is going to be a different type of DKIM record that you're going to create. It's not going to be a CNAME record anymore. In this case, it's going to become a text record. And the reason why is because now when you do this on your own, you're generating a private key and you're generating the public key. Okay, you're generating the private key and public key, so therefore you have to be responsible for publishing that key, right? Because when you're doing a CNAME is an alias. You're pointing to Microsoft and saying, okay, this is the key that you're going to use, the one that's defined for this for the .onmicrosoft.com domain. That's the key to use. So they're responsible for maintaining those keys. But in this case situation, you are now maintaining the key. So how do you create that key? You go OpenDKIM. Oh, sorry, sudo. Sudo. You have to be root in order to do this. Sudo OpenDKIM dash gen key is the command. Then you're going to find the key length, so either 1024 or 2048. Then you're going to find the domain that you're generating the key for, so .dmarc.org. Then you're going to define where the keys are going to be saved. So I'm going to put it in etc OpenDKIM, and there should be a keys folder, and I'm going to put it in a .dmarc.org folder. -s is going to find what is the name of the selector you're going to use. So the selector is going to be the name, right? The name of the record you're creating, right? So like in Microsoft, it was selector 1 and selector 2. That was the name of the selector. So they predefined it. In this case, you define what it is. You can create what it is and make sure what it is. But just remember what you put as the value, because that's the name you're going to use in DNS, right? So the name can be anything you want, right? Typically, the best thing to do is, one thing people do is they put the name of the server that they're using, right? So the mail server, the name of the mail server they're using. I'm just going to use default. Again, you can use whatever you want. You're not restricted to, there's really no restriction in this. Some people put a date in there, so that way they know that, okay, this is the date it was created. So that way they know later on when they need to consider creating a new one or rolling it over. And then I'm going to put -v. -v kind of gives it verbose, so that way you can see, what's going on. So now I have my DKIM key. So now I need to make sure that I have, so here's the private key, right? So create the private key, takes from that private key, it created the default key, right? So typically what I also do is make sure that make sure that the appropriate services have access to it. So I make sure the permissions are set up correctly. But for the sake of time, because we have 8 minutes, there's other things I want to show you. But what I need to do now is I need to look at the DNS record, the public key record. So I'm in default.txt. So I'm going to do is sudo cat. So cat shows me the file. Etc OpenDKIM keys got DMARC.org / default.txt. So what it's showing me here is basically the record that I need to create. So I'm going to take all of this, copy it, go back into my zone file, and append it to my file. So I'm going to go to my DKIM section and basically paste that in. And there you go. Now I have my DKIM record. So this is a text record in this case. So I know if you're using Google G Suites, G Suites also does a text record as well. They don't do CNAME records. They do text records. So this is similar to what you would be doing when you're creating this. So that's very quickly just to show you what, if you're creating a text record if you're using text records for DKIM, this is what you would do. So I know if people are saying there's probably syntax errors in certain spots, that's fine. This isn't live, so I'm not too worried about spelling situation. So this isn't actually going to break anything that's live and out there. So now DMARC. So the other thing to take into account. So you notice how there's quotation marks here. So for DKIM, they're using quotation marks. The reason they're using quotation marks is because of the semicolon, right? Because see the semicolon here. So when you're creating a bind file and using bind here, the semicolon is actually considered a comment. So if these quotation marks weren't here, anything after this semicolon would be considered a comment and would have been ignored. Okay, so that's something you have to take into consideration. And so it's the same thing that you have to do with DMARC, right? When you're creating your DMARC record, so we're just going to create it right here. So underscore DMARC in text, and we're going to start creating it. So we're going to use quotes. So V equals DMARC1 semicolon. Oops. All right, so this is where we're going to actually start using it in this case. All right, so this is the situation. So this is what's going on, and this is how it works. So you make sure you do that. In Linux, you have to do that. So if you were in the Windows one, we didn't use quotes or quotation marks in any way, so it's not required. Even if you put in the quote or the single quotes in there, it would have removed them for you. But so it wouldn't have been an issue. But in here, you do need to do that. So quote V equals DMARC1 semicolon. Put in your P tag equals none semicolon, and then RUA equals mail2 colon DMARC at .dmarc.org semicolon, and then also RUF equals end quote. All right, there's my DMARC record. So I've started off with DMARC. I started with policy at none. I didn't put in an RI tag, so it defaults to 24 hours. So within a 24-hour period, I should start getting reports, and I can review those reports. And then I can, if based on my reports, if I say, okay, well, you know what, everything looks great and everything looks fine, I'm going to move up to reject. So I'm just making the change here, right? So if I'm still say a none, and I'm saying, okay, well, you know what, I'm at none, but I'm noticing that subdomains are being used. So what I need to do is I'll put in SP equals reject for my DMARC record. So that way now I have SP equals, so at least this way now I'm working on this, and then I'm not fixing everything and doing what I need to do and not worrying about subdomains, right? And then at this point, I mean, if I needed to add the other ones, I could always go in, add ADKIM equals, I want to make sure DKIM is strict. I should have gone after the quotes, but ADKIM equals S semicolon, right? So I can start doing these and adding these and modifying it. But in most cases, when you're modifying your records, you're most likely going to be changing the P values, the P tags, or you may need to change your email address, right? So like if I said, okay, well, you know what, I need to add another email address, I can put in comma mail2 colon, I don't know, say I wanted to actually get it to my own mailbox. Not that I would, but if I wanted to. I could just go like that and just add the mail items in there. So those are things that you're going to put in and where you're putting it in. All right, so those are the signs. So that's what you're doing with DMARC and when you're creating your DMARC records. All right, so what I want to also just show you really quickly, I mean, it's 2 minutes. We did start 2 minutes late, so we'll probably go over time for a little bit because I do want to show you these other things. One thing to take into account, so if you're not using a domain for a particular purpose, so say you don't have, say you have SPF in here, but you're not actually using it, so you're not using this domain for mail. So what do? I can get rid of all of this and put in -all. That's all I need for SPF because this domain is not being used for email. So therefore, I'm just going to put in empty SPF record in. Then pretend like none of these DMARC records exist either. But then what I would do is that with DMARC, I would just change this policy here to reject. And that's all I would do, right? So I would make sure all these other records are not, obviously the DMARC records, that, you don't need to have DKIM in place for any of these, right? So you don't need any of this. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the end of the line. You don't need any of this stuff here for DKIM, right? You don't need to have a DKIM records if you don't have any, if this doesn't have any, it's not being used for mail, right? All you just need is for SPF, V equals SPF1-all, and then for DMARC, just put in a DMARC policy of reject. You don't technically need to have the mail part of it if you, the reporting part of it. I do recommend having the reporting part just because, I mean, it doesn't hurt to know whether these domains are actually being used for in spam campaigns and such like that. I mean, you may, hopefully if it's not being used for email, you should get no reports. But once you get that one report, now you know it's being used for spam, or it's been used in a spamming type campaign. Right, so these are the things you have to take into account. So we created SPF records, we created DKIM records, we created DMARC records. I showed you what to do if the domain is not being used for email, because it's nice and quick. Just go ahead and create those types of things as well. So those are all the things that you would do and that you would need to create when it comes to using DKIM and doing the DKIM implementation using bind. So now the next steps at this point is, now that we know and you know how to do this, go ahead and start. I mean, that's our recommendation. Go ahead, put in a record of DMARC equal _ DMARC and the value of none. You start off with the RUA and RUF tags, start getting those reports, start reviewing those reports. Next week, what we're going to do is tell you how to interpret those reports and how to start using those reports. All right, but if you're courageous enough and you want to start doing it now and start getting those reports, if you have questions on it, feel free to reach out or post those questions on the community forum. But we're going to go as best as we can in depth next week on DMARC reports. What are the things that are in the DMARC reports, what the two types of reports are, what types of the information you can find in that report. Tomorrow, we're doing Cloud DNS. So Cloud DNS, I mean using something like Google Cloud DNS, GoDaddy, 1&1 DNS, those types of, those hosting providers. So we have access to a few, so I'm going to show you how to do them, but they're pretty much similar in all the other ones. But then, like I said, week 4 is going to be all about reporting and report documentation. So we are at 2:02. There are a few questions. I'm just going to take a look at, there's 1 or 2 questions I actually wanted to answer. So hopefully the people are still on. So one is, both selectors use the same public-private keys. So for Office 365, they should be using 2 different keys when you create this. So that's why they have selector 1 and selector 2. It actually points to 2 different ones. So they do 2 different keys, and they do often, and you can actually rotate those as well through that. So when would I use D or when I would use S alone? The only times you would ever really use those alone is if the only thing that's causing issues is DKIM or SPF, right? Because you know it's constantly failing and you want to know why SPF is failing. So when you look at the reports and you see that DKIM is always passing. So there's typically not going to be a failure for that. So if you wanted to just do S alone, so you just, but SPF is constantly failing, you want to know which messages are the ones that are failing SPF, then put in the FO equals S. So that way you can get, so every time there's a failure because of SPF, you get those messages and you get that information. For single quotes, SPF and double quotes, yeah, that was a mistake on my part. I should have been double quotes. But I mean, yeah, it should be double quotes. So I don't see any other questions. If there are any questions that you think of afterwards that you're not thinking of right now, or if you're going through the process of DKIM, you can email us directly or post the questions that you may have on the community forum. The advantage of doing it at the community forum is that you have other subject matter experts, aside from myself and other members of the GCA team. There are other groups that are on there as well that can potentially answer your questions, especially if I can't get to it right away. But thank you for joining, and I hope to see you next week on the reporting, because the reports are very critical and very important. So it's important that you do join that session. So answer this one last question, since I do still have people on. So where do you store the private key? So if you're generating it on your own, you store the private key on the mail server that's going to be signing the system. And it should be in a secure folder that the mail server has access to, and you as admin technically should have access to it, because you need to be able to create the keys and put the keys in that folder. But that's where the private key needs, because the private key needs to be stored on the mail server, because the mail server is what's going to use that private key to do the signing. So that's where the private key would be stored. And that is the last question again. So thank you, everyone. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and close out the session. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you next week or tomorrow if you're going to join the session tomorrow.